this is Miss Hadi from Olympian High School. This is for Mr. Hammond in my classes. We're learning Chapter 20 in Traditions and Encounters, which is about Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. So first, just paying attention to Western Europe, knowing where that is. So Western Europe didn't look back then as it looks today. So just keeping in mind that the boundaries and the states changed. So for example, you might be used to thinking of Italy as being one singular state, like an autonomous state, one political authority, but back then it was a bunch of different kinds of states. So you have papal states, which are territories that belong to the Pope. You have principalities, which are governed by princes. You have lots of little cities that control themselves called city-states, Venice being one of them that you're introduced to in the vignette. And also keeping in mind that at the time, the Byzantine Empire, which is a continuation of the Roman Empire from the classical period, was in Eastern Europe. And just understanding that also at the time, you have the Muslims or the Dar al-Islam that had been spreading. And also now we know where we are and what's going on in history. And we know that this is the post-classical period. So in China, you have Sui Tong Song. You have a lot of trade happening because of Indian Ocean trade, Trans-Saharan trade. We know about the revived Silk Roads. Okay, so just knowing where we are in history, where we are in the world, and making sure we understand like what we're walking into when we get into chapter 20. The last chapter on Europe in your book was chapter 17. And in that chapter, you learned about Europe in the early Middle Ages. And now, as you can see, there's a distinction. It's the High Middle Ages. So what is that distinction? Each historian is going to have different markers for when the early Middle Ages or the High Middle Ages are. But we can think of the early Middle Ages as roughly right from the beginning of the post-classical period, so either 500 or 600 CE, to right around 1000 CE, and then think of the High Middle Ages as roughly 1000 CE to 1300 CE, although some historians might extend it beyond that point. And there is a difference. In the early Middle Ages, we see Europe as not really being integrated or connected into some of the trade networks and as fully as other post-classical states were. And in the High Middle Ages, that's going to change. So in the early Middle Ages, the things that were necessary to get Europe to the place they would be in High Middle Ages were being laid. The foundations were being laid for that. So the High Middle Ages, there's some big changes. There's demographic growth, meaning there's more people. There's agricultural growth. And there's new forms of political organization. And these forms of political organization will be an alternative to what we see in terms of centralized states in other parts of the world. So Europe is going to develop along a more decentralized model where you have regional states. But those regional states are becoming more powerful. They're not an empire per se, but they are becoming more powerful. So let's get into the book. So you have chapter 20, you have this interesting vignette. So notice that chapter 20 is made up of 4 parts. So Mr. Hammond's going to teach you about this part, and I'll teach you about the other parts. It starts off with an amazing story about the Polos, the Polo family. And it's an important symbolic story because it represents Europe becoming more integrated and connected into the larger economic networks that were developed in Eurasia right around the 1200s and the 1200s, 1300s. So the Polo family, as you know, were jewel merchants, and it tells you that they ended up traveling to try to, by caravan, to try to sell their wares, and a war broke out behind them, and they couldn't go back home. Talk about, right now we're in a difficult situation with the pandemic, but back then you didn't know what was going to happen. You might be in a war, there might be a disease that breaks out. So basically they had to keep going east, and they wound up going to the Mongol state of the Great Khans, the Yuan dynasty with Kublai Khan. And he requests that they bring back Christian missionaries. So they go back to the Pope, they ask for missionaries to accompany them, to go back to the court of Kublai Khan. Unfortunately, those missionaries get scared on the way because there's fighting, so they leave, and they end up going back to the court of Kublai Khan. They complete their travels in 1274, although they started in 1271. And Kublai Khan receives them warmly. Again, he's interested in like a religion that might unify or appeal to many different groups of people because his dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, is so diverse. Anyway, this is when Marco Polo accompanies them on this mission. He ends up spending 17 years in the court of Kublai Khan, maybe served as part of the ministers. Might not have. So again, this period, 500 to 1000 CE, or the early period was the early Middle Ages, and then the High Middle Ages is 1000 to 1300. We're going to see a lot of changes, and that's enough to get you started on your learning for chapter 20. We'll just see a lot of changes. We'll go into it in the video lectures.